So I'm a little late to the party on this one, but the animation pipeline for me is pretty long, so I can't always respond to things immediately. A couple of weeks ago, Cody of the channel Taking 20 posted a video about why he's quitting Pathfinder 2e. This invited such a wide range of response videos that Cody made a response video to the response videos, which invited even more response videos. But it was in Cody's response that he invoked the idea of an illusion of choice, and he provided what I think are some pretty solid gameplay examples. And this idea of illusion of choice piqued one of my recreational interests, which is game theory, a weird intersection of psychology and mathematics. So let's take a trip into real-world land for a moment so I can talk about the design behind RPGs and what they've taken from other games over the past decade or so. Are you ready? Okay, so let's talk about some elements of good game design. So one of the first things is that modern board games teach us is to kind of keep the players engaged even when it's not their turn. And a really good example of that is Settlers of Catan, but I mean even kind of Monopoly did that right, because when you play Monopoly, you really pay attention when it's not your turn because you want someone else to land on your property. But in Settlers of Catan, when it's not your turn, someone else is rolling the dice, and depending on what they rolled, you might get resources even when it's not your turn. If you're playing a 4-player game, 3 other people could be giving you resources. So that's one thing that modern board games do to kind of keep people engaged even when it's not their turn. And I think actually D&D 5th edition and Pathfinder 2e, they both do a pretty good job of this. 5e does the reaction system where every player, when it's not their turn, gets a reaction. And so everybody is really engaged during combat to kind of keep an eye out for their opportunity to use their reaction spells, their reaction feats, their reaction class abilities, that sort of thing. So this is something that definitely modern RPGs have picked up from modern board gaming. Now another important aspect is good choice variety, and this is important but not a direct path to fun. One of the games that I have that really does a good job of this is Forbidden Island. And what's interesting about Forbidden Island is that it uses an action point system kind of similar to what I've been hearing about coming from 2e, where each player gets 3 actions and they can be used in different combinations. And Forbidden Island does that too, but there is kind of a problem with Forbidden Island and also similar games like Forbidden Desert and Pandemic, which is that experienced players, they kind of know the optimal methodology to win the game. They've played enough times that they know what's important at the beginning of the game, in the mid-game, and in the end game. And experienced players can even get kind of frustrated playing with new players when they do things like this. Forbidden Island, yeah, definitely the sort of action point allowance style system that will definitely keep someone engaged for a solid 40 or 50 game. But choice variety isn't the end of fun, though. Choice variety, it doesn't guarantee fun. In fact, limiting choices can actually streamline gameplay and elevate the enjoyment of the game. A good example of that is Cosmic Encounter. And the funny thing about Cosmic Encounter is you don't even get to decide whether or not you have an encounter with another player, and you don't even get to decide which player that is. You draw from a deck of cards, and this decide who has an encounter with who, which essentially turns Cosmic Encounter into kind of like a weird game of spin the bottle, but with aliens. Oh, this is who you're having an encounter with. Yep, happens just like that. So yeah, it does kind of turn the game into a weird sci-fi variation of spin the bottle. Honestly, the only decisions you really make is how many ships to send, not whether or not you have an encounter and whether or not you go into combat or negotiate with the other player. So, but by taking like the decision of who has an encounter with who away from the players can't really, point the finger at each other and say, hey, you were playing unfairly with me. I was playing unfairly with you. It's the deck that kind of decides that sort of thing. And that randomness kind of elevates the quirkiness of the game and gives it the flavor that it has. So another element that modern board games kind of bring to RPGs is the variation in game state. And this is a player board from Trajan. In Trajan, what you do is you play this kind of weird Mancala game. You pick one of the 6 pools that you have on your player board, you pick up the pegs from one of it, and you kind of play this Mancala game and drop one to here and one to here, and whichever space you land on last, that's the action you get to do. In other words, I would get to do action number 2 here. But take a look at the state of this player board, and you notice I don't have an option to do action number 2 immediately again. If I take the pool from number 1 here, it's going to go 1, 2, 3 spaces. I'm not going to be able to do that again. So if I want to do action number 2 twice, I kind of have to think ahead. So I can take the pull from action number 3 here and do action 5 off the bat. And then I can take the pull from action 6. And now I can take action number 2. And then I can take the pull from action 5. And now I can take action 2 twice. So the board state kind of forces the player to think well ahead. This is something I think RPGs could use a little bit more of. The resources that the players are giving are things like their health, their spells, their encounter powers, their short rest powers, their long rest powers. And really the only variation in state from encounter to encounter to encounter is whether or not you've gotten some of those back. So there's some element of management in modern RPGs, but not a lot. So the last factor I want to bring up is the concept of choice variety versus choice weight. And I think this is what Cody is really trying to pursue in his gaming group. So what is weight? Weight is how the player measures the impact of their choices. And I'm going to provide you with an example of a game that weighs choices really well. And this is a game called Patchwork. So in Patchwork, you actually only have a few choices. So here's this little timepiece marker, and on your turn, you get to buy one of these 3 pieces using buttons, which are kind of the currency of the game. You buy one of the 3 pieces that are clockwise of the timepiece. After you buy one of those pieces, you take it away, and the timepiece jumps forward to that position. But think about all the different factors that go into this. Number 1, you got the cost. So you got these 2 here that cost 7 buttons, but this one's really cheap. But you also have this time aspect, this little hourglass. So this determines how far forward ahead you move, and it can potentially induce an extra turn as long as you're staying behind your opponent. So like this one only costs 1 time, so as long as you still got some money left over, you could potentially take a second turn. The other one is the fitment on the player board. Like this one's really cheap, but this might be kind of awkward to fit on the player board, which is only like a 9x9 grid, like that. This is the amount of space it takes up. Then there's the income received. These buttons on these pieces at regular intervals of the game, they give you income if they're on your player board. There's also the aspect of skipping patches. If this looks like a piece that would fit really well on opponent's board, maybe you might want to pick one of these 2 other pieces. Now, another aspect is which passages get skipped over in the process. If one of these 2 pieces looks like it would fit really well on your opponent's board really easily, this may elevate the importance of choosing this one. So all in all, with cost, time consumed, the fitment on your own board, the fitment on your opponent's board, the space taken, the income received from on-patch buttons, and which patch gets skipped over in your decision, and whether or not you get to take an extra turn, you have 8 factors in the decision-making process of choosing one of those 3 patches. And this is a game about making a quilt. This isn't high fantasy combat with things at stake. It's not the stakes that make the decision interesting in Patchwork. It's the weight. It's the number of factors that you have to consider as a player when making that decision. And the complexity of weight is one of the reasons that Uwe Rosenberg's games are so good. I personally own 3 of them. So I think that this is more along the lines of what Cody is looking for in his game. Now, in modern RPGs, weight is something that is definitely a lot easier to create in roleplay than in combat. You can use a combination of fantasy social convention, player background, and inspirations from literature and film, and these give great guidelines to add weight to player choices in roleplay. But carefully governed combat is an important part of RPGs, especially those that originate with wargames the way D&D did with Chainmail. Players need a reasonable expectation of their characters' chances of survival. And if combat is going to occupy a substantial portion of each player's class abilities, the equipment section, the combat rules themselves, and a large chunk of the spells and effects from status conditions, it really needs to be on point, a good game entirely on its own. In other words, if all you got to do in D&D was the combat should still be interesting. And the idea of combat is exciting. It's something that most people don't get to do in real life and probably aren't that great at in real life as well. But I think what Wizards of the Coast did right with 5e is that they moved the numbers away from the player stats and put more emphasis on the die. You no longer have these giant plus 10 proficiency bonuses at high levels. 5e goes from plus 2 to plus 5, and that's it. It elevates the gamble. And doing away with clear-cut bonuses and penalties and replacing them with advantage and disadvantage only adds to that gamble. It makes that 1 in 400 double 1 on advantage or double 20 on disadvantage a truly momentous occasion for everyone at the table. And interestingly, in Cody's example, the Pathfinder 2e and the 5e differences, one of the things that he left out for that ranger in his example was Sharpshooter, which is another example of the gamble that's introduced in 5e. You can take a -5 to your hit roll in order to take plus 10 to your damage. And this is something that the player has to weigh. Am I willing to take that hit on my probability of helping out another player versus the chance to do more damage and help them out in a different way? So that's what I have for my examples. Let's go back to Animated World. Is Cody right though? I lean about 70% in favor of yes. If he's looking for more weight, but not necessarily more variety in the decision process of character builds and combat, I think you'll find a little more of that in 5e. The Pathfinder scenario presented in Cody's video on Taking 20 about the illusion of choice is definitely one where the alternatives are lacking in meaningful weight. Are there ways that the DM can improve this? Absolutely. But if a game is going to go into that level of detail in combat, there's no reason weight can't be better integrated into it. That's essential to effective game design. That's all I had for this video. I'll get back to some more Deathwatch Hot Fuzz in 2 weeks with some new character models. Thanks for watching.